event, the Introductory Workshop on Women's Employment Data in Tourism Measurement Challenges and Solutions, will be officially opened by Marina Biotalevi, Head of Ethics, Culture, and Social Responsibility Department at Uwto. Marina is in charge of cultural tourism, social aspects related to tourism, in particular gender equality and women's empowerment, accessibility for persons with disability, human rights, indigenous communities, and corporate social responsibility. On gender equality and women's empowerment, Marina was also responsible for the release in 2019 of the second edition of the Global Report on Women in Tourism. In 2021, it started the implementation of the Center Stage project for women's empowerment during the COVID-19 recovery in 4 countries. Marina, please.
Thank you very much, Nagore. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for being with us for today's workshop. It is a pleasure to see so many new faces connected. We have been very pleased with the interest shown in this topic. On behalf of UNWTO, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's workshop. UNWTO is the specialized agency of the United Nations that promotes tourism as the motor of economic growth, inclusive development, and sustainability at the global level. Under this mandate and our shared commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we work to promote gender equality and women's empowerment within the sector. As part of this work, we carry out research and evaluate the different ways that tourism can further contribute to the Sustainable Development number 5. So we are delighted to be organizing this workshop jointly with our statistics department under UNWTO's flagship Center Stage project. The project is kindly supported by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the German Agency for International Cooperation, and UN Women. One of the main objectives of the Center Stage project is to provide support for our member states in the production and reporting of tourism data that is disaggregated by sex. We hope that this workshop will be a first step on the road to widespread and comprehensive reporting of data on women's employment in tourism. We encourage you all to use what we discussed today to spur further action within your member state to make this a reality. The activities of the Center Stage project are rooted in the recommendations of the UNWTO Global Report on Women in Tourism, the second edition that we published in 2019, and its subsequent action plan. Both are available on the UNWTO e-library for free, along with our other materials on women in tourism. So the key finding of the global report is that the availability of sex disaggregated tourism data allows for better targeted gender equality interventions in the sector and leads to greater women's empowerment. However, at a global level, there is a lack of available data on women's employment in tourism. For the year 2020, only 12 national tourism administrations have communicated this data to UNWTO. So there's a lot of work ahead of us to reach the high levels of sex disaggregated tourism statistics we hope for. But you may be asking, why is this data so important? Well, many destinations don't produce tourism data disaggregated by sex. This hinders the ability of governments and businesses to targeted and intelligent policymaking, thus reducing the effectiveness of policies to move the sector towards gender equality and help to empower many more women and girls. In addition, this data gap hinders the analysis and evaluation of women's participation in the tourism sector. In our research, the lack of widespread data means that UNWTO often has to use proxy indicators in our reports and analysis in order to draw conclusions about the situation of women in tourism. Proxies, such as the modeled estimate that ILO produces on accommodation and food services sector. Combined with our extensive qualitative research, these proxies allow us to reach valid conclusions and produce informed recommendations. However, these remain general and are at a global level or regional level only. For example, we have found that 54% of the tourism workforce is female at a global level, that women are concentrated in unstable and low-skilled employment, that the gender wage gap in tourism is 14.7% at a global level, something that is especially disappointing given the large number of women that tourism employs. Well, for all these reasons, we meet today to begin our work together with you, our member states, to put in place the foundations that will allow us to develop informed policies, programs, and strategies that are based on concrete and recent data. These tools will help to boost the tourism sector's empowering potential for women and reduce the gender gaps that are persisting in our sector. So on behalf of the Ethics, Culture and Social Responsibility Department, I would like to thank our colleagues in the UNWTO Statistics Department, Clara and Leandri, our German partners, UN Women, and especially Isabella Smith and ILO for their participation and intervention. But most importantly, I would like to thank you for your interest in today's workshop. So we at UNWTO remain at your disposal to support your efforts to increase the amount of data being produced and reported, which will help us all to advance gender equality in our sector. So thank you very much for participating today, and I pass the floor back to Nagore. Thank you very much, Nagore. And
thank you. All right, so we continue with the program, and now we're going to count with Clara van der Pol, Chief of the Statistics Department at UNWTO. Clara has more than 13 years of experience in the field of tourism statistics, working for the World Tourism Organization. Currently, as Chief of the Statistics Department, her work focuses on the promotion of international standards in close liaison with the United Nations system. She also oversees the department's activities in the statistical training and in the collection and dissemination of data sets. Clara represents UNWTO in various committees and expert groups, including the United Nations Statistical Commissions since 2012. So, Clara, looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Nagore. Allow me to just check with all of you that you can see my screen properly and you can hear me.
Yeah. Excellent.
So thank you so much. And it really is a pleasure to be here with you all today and to have contributed as a statistics department together with my colleague Leandri to the organization of this important workshop. This series of workshops is in fact the first in the history of UNWTO that is dedicated exclusively to the topic of measuring the employment of women in the tourism sector. So we're very proud of this milestone. We know that this is a very important topic for many of our member states, and we're very happy that we have the opportunity to organize this in the framework of the Center Stage project. So this workshop is inevitably an introductory one, but we're hoping that it will reveal a few things. So first of all, the need to take this matter very seriously, and especially in view of the recovery of the tourism sector and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals while leaving no one behind. Second, that measuring the situation of women in tourism employment is not necessarily very difficult, but it's not very straightforward either. So it can be a little bit tricky. And third, that coordination between experts and government entities, as well as is usual in tourism statistics more generally, is absolutely crucial in the space of women's employment in tourism statistics. And if after this workshop there is an appetite, perhaps we can use this experience to formulate a more ambitious capacity building project on the matter in the future. So let's get started. Statistics is about mobilizing the power of data to make better decisions in the interest of the public good. For example, how can we design support packages for tourism recovery if we don't know the number of tourism enterprises or the people they employ? Statistics provides us this common ground to better understand the world around us, and for different stakeholders to come together and engage in a conversation about where we are, where we want to go, and how to get there. And in a world that is increasingly saturated with data of all kinds, it's more important than ever to have data that we can trust. In other words, data that are a proper reflection of reality. Statistics are designed to build this trust. Statistical data is independent, impartial, and transparent. It's methodologically sound and has been elaborated with scientific principles. Statistical outputs are elaborated to optimize relevance, accuracy, timeliness, accessibility, and comparability of the data. And statistics can come from various sources, from surveys, from census, from administrative data, and increasingly statistics also comes from privately held sources, like big data. Statistics are statistics because of the values that they embody. And these are precisely what bring about credibility and trust in the data. So why are international organizations like the UN and UNWTO concerned with statistics? Well, because statistics is in essence an agreed way of measuring something. And if we transfer this beyond national borders, that is, if we seek to compare, for example, our economic development or the sustainability of our tourism sectors between countries, we need an international agreement between these countries. We need an international consensus. Now, there are, of course, in statistics, important technical elements, but you will agree with me that measuring something in one way or another affects the results, right? And this has strategic and political implications in countries. And so it's important for countries to agree if we want to compare between countries, destinations, and to other sectors. And indeed, UNWTO, as the UN Specialized Agency for Tourism, has a UN mandate in tourism statistics, which calls upon it to collect, analyze, publish, standardize, and to overall improve the statistics of tourism, while promoting the integration of these statistics in the sphere of the United Nations system. And so the way that UNWTO supports the development of tourism statistics worldwide is basically threefold. First, through the development of standards. These are the international norms that contain the consensus around the concepts, definitions, and data organization structures for measuring tourism. At UNWTO, we lead technical developments and also multilateral coordination for the continuous improvement of tourism statistics and its adaptation to ever-evolving user needs. Second, UNWTO also supports through capacity development. This includes work on compilation guides that translate the standards into practical implementation guidance. It includes the collection of best practices and also the organization of training workshops, such as this one, and more and bigger capacity development projects. And third, all of this data that is produced in countries in line with the standards is then collected, compiled, and processed by UNWTO into international data sets. And now across these three pillars of standards, capacity, and data, UNWTO works on three core topics. We have basic tourism statistics, so-called basic tourism statistics. Not basic because they are simple, but basic because we understand that they are the basic sort of essential set of information that tourism destinations need to have. Second, the economic contribution of tourism, also known as the tourism satellite accounts, and third, sustainability. Now, these three core topics derive from the internationally agreed definition of tourism, which, as we know, is a social, cultural, and economic phenomenon. Tourism has an impact on the economy, on the natural and built environments, on the local population at the places visited, and even on the visitors themselves. And so we need statistics that allow us to measure these various aspects of tourism. And so there are currently 2 agreed frameworks endorsed by the UN as international standard for measuring tourism. And these are shown here on the screen. On the left, we have the International Recommendations for Tourism Statistics, which guides the production of data on visitor flows and characteristics, tourism expenditure, and tourism industries. And in the middle, we have the tourism satellite account, which brings all of this information together in an accounting framework and enables the derivation of information on tourism, GDP, the value added of the tourism industries, and the related jobs. Currently, UNWTO is also working on the development of a statistical framework for measuring sustainability of tourism. And this framework covers environmental and social aspects also, such as water and energy use, emissions and solid waste, land use, decent work, health, education, and culture. And it also includes more economic aspects from a sustainability lens. So business demographics, seasonality, and associated jobs, for example. Now, in terms of the second pillar that we work on at UNWTO, capacity development, UNWTO offers support to countries in all 3 core topics, as mentioned. For example, we do capacity building programs, and also together with our technical cooperation department, we provide direct technical assistance to countries. Now, in terms of the third pillar, and more interesting one perhaps for the purposes of this workshop, UNWTO manages the most comprehensive database on tourism statistics worldwide. It covers over 145 key tourism statistics from all countries in the world on inbound, outbound, and domestic tourism, tourism industries, employment, and some trade statistics-based macroeconomic indicators. Now, UNWTO also compiles data on tourism direct GDP, the level of TSA, right, implementation of the tourism satellite account, and also data on the readiness of countries' statistical system to monitor the sustainability of tourism. All of these indicators are, in fact, indicators included in the UN Global Indicator Framework for the Sustainable Development Goals for monitoring tourism within the SDGs. Now, more specifically in relation to employment, these are the data and indicators compiled by UNWTO in its database. And throughout this workshop, we will see some very interesting country experiences, and we'll see data that UNWTO collects from countries. Now, as also mentioned by my colleague Marina, there is clearly room for improvement of the coverage of this data. The coverage in our statistical database, to be frank, is low, and even more so if we look at the data reported on women's employment in the tourism sector. Now, there are a few reasons that we can speculate about that might help to explain these data gaps. And first, it may be the case that there is indeed, no data because there are no data sources in the countries. This might be a possibility. But personally, I think that there are other reasons, perhaps more common, and that perhaps there are existing data sources in the countries, but that these are not exploited to produce data specifically on tourism or on the situation of women. It may happen that the existing industry disaggregation in employment data does not allow for tourism industries to be identified properly, or that disaggregation by sex is not being implemented. Or it may happen that even if the existing sources are being exploited and countries do produce disaggregated data, but perhaps not all stakeholders are aware of this, or perhaps for some other reasons, the data is not reported to the UNWTO database. Now, in light of this, a small step that this workshop takes in this direction of perhaps improving data coverage could be of raising awareness about the main concepts, definitions, and classifications for producing statistics on women's employment in tourism specifically. And second, that there is a potential for generating data by gaining a better understanding of the wealth of data sources that exist that could be tapped into. Third, there is a crucial importance of interinstitutional cooperation between national entities, always so important in tourism statistics more generally, but specifically so in this case. And fourth, we're going to be showcasing some fascinating experiences from countries and international organizations in this area, also as perhaps an inspiration. Now, allow me to show you a few examples of data from UNWTO, from the database. Now, this is the situation before the pandemic hit, and we can see that indeed, as largely communicated by many entities, tourism is or was overall a generator of employment. According to the data reported to UNWTO, the annual growth in employment in the tourism industries was significantly higher compared to the growth in the general employment, in the total economy. And we see that this finding holds or held for all regions of the world. Now, here we see the impact of the pandemic. At the global level, we see that the reporting countries did indeed experience a drop in employment in the tourism industries, but this drop of approximately 15% of the reporting countries was nowhere near the drop seen in several other global aggregates, such as inbound arrivals or inbound tourism expenditure, where the decrease was in the order of some 74% or so, which is really massive. Now, we see that employment in tourism in the reporting countries did decrease, but not to this extent. So perhaps this may point to a certain effectiveness of government schemes to support employment throughout 2020. And then here we see the example of Spain, the host country of UNWTO's headquarters, which is a best practice example in data reporting. Here we see data on full-time equivalent jobs, which is a tourism satellite account aggregate. And we can see how this can be disaggregated by males and females, and also by status in employment, so employees and self-employed. So this is really interesting data. And finally, I would also like to mention that as part of the Measuring the Sustainability of Tourism line of work, some countries are exploring the generation of even richer data on employment characteristics of women in tourism. For example, Germany measured the wage gap between men and women and the proportion of employees with low wages in tourism compared to that of the whole economy. And these issues are central to understanding the situation of women in the tourism sector. Now, with this, I come to the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of the experiences today and engaging in the conversation on this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clara. All right, so we're going to continue with the session that is called Measuring Tourism Employment, an overview of its specificities, its specificities and challenges. I'll be speaking about that. So I'll be sharing my screen. By the way, what I meant with the full names is that in when you appear on Zoom, that you're in the list of participants, you see yourself with your full name. So there's no need to write in the chat if each of you your full name or your organization. Don't worry about that. Thank you very much. Okay. So. All right. Okay, so I'll try to transmit concepts and not bore you, which is a bit tough, but I'll try my best to do it. So the content of the presentation, let me see if I can move this. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be addressing the necessary governance that we need for, as Clara was saying, to obtain this relevant data that we know is not especially easy to be obtained, but it's critical for decision making. Key concepts, trying to clarify certain, certain concepts versus others that sometimes in simply plain our language or in English or so seem similar, but they actually mean very different things. So with definitions and classifications. The sources of information that most countries use. We're going to look at the different approaches that can be done, and also what they entail. In that logic, we're going to see some country examples, but remember that immediately after this session, we're going to have 3 countries that have been nice enough to share their experience with us this morning. And then I'm going to be showing what Clara was mentioning now about the data that different countries you're sharing with Uwto, that as she mentioned, there's room for improvement in terms of, the different countries collecting the data and sharing it with Uwto. So I know that this sounds like every time we address any kind of topic, we always say that collaboration is key. But if it is even more evident in this case, because if you think that, for instance, you work at the Ministry of Tourism, you're not going to have the data. You're not the source of this information. At the same time, if you're the Statistics Bureau or Institute or the authority on the statistics in the country, perhaps it's not even you who has the data. Perhaps it's the Ministry of Labor or the Authority on Employment or Social Security entities. So we really need cooperation between different entities that have different roles. They are not waking every morning thinking on women's employment in tourism, okay? Because the Ministry of Labor has tons of other things to be worried about beyond not just tourism, because the Statistics Institute Bureau or Authority has different topics to be addressing. So we have to reach agreements and collaboration with different entities so that we achieve this information that is critical to then improve the situation in employment of both male and female. So the usual basic or minimum entities that are to be collaborating would be the tourism authority in each country, let it be a ministry or whichever format that the country has, the private tourism sector, because they are the owners in the sense of the contracts, and they are the ones contracting and generating employment. The Employment Authority, Ministry of Labor, whichever it's called in each of the different countries, and the Statistical Authority. In some countries, it might be a fifth partner, as I was mentioned before, perhaps the Social Security entities, or it might be even a fifth entity. So as I said, each of these entities, and the private sector is a lot of entities themselves, they have different reasons for being. And specifically measuring the tourism statistics is not necessarily their role. So it really means creating a collaborative spirit, understanding why this is critical, why it's relevant, why we need to secure funds for this to be accomplished, so that we obtain rigorous data for decision making, as Marina at the beginning was explaining, as Clara was saying also. Something that is critical also is the statistical capacity. So imagine that we are already in a situation where these 4 entities or groupings are actually working together, but we need to have, as the second step, the statistical capacity to be able to address this challenge. So a sound statistical infrastructure, support systems to maintain sampling frames over time. If we are going for survey approaches, which in most cases that's the main source of information, either for household surveys or business surveys or labor surveys, a critical mass of ongoing statistical activities, in the sense that there's a continuum in terms of human resources that they're really good at what they do, and they continue doing it over time because this is sustain human capital and capital also, technical and methodological ability to maintain so that the figures that come out of these exercises actually are trustworthy. Adequate statistical frameworks and IT infrastructure, because usually that helps if it's not paper-based. Good management to make the best use of available resources. Of course, policies in place in terms of transparency, in terms of protecting data, so that we foster that the private sector is more willing to give this information, or even a legal framework that allow us to collect continuously this information, if we're thinking in terms of census, or we're thinking even in terms of surveys. There are different approaches from different countries in this sense. All right. We move into the key concepts. So tourism sector is contemplated in the tourism satellite account is the set of production units of different industries. Okay, so one of the key terms that we're going to be talking about today is tourism industries as a concept, as the tourism activities, economic activities that are within the concept of tourism sector. And these production units are those that provide consumer goods and services demanded by visitors. This is critical that we have it defined in each of our countries. Which are those tourism industries out of all the industries that we can have in our economy, which are the ones that are mostly producing consumer goods and services that are consumed by visitors. So if we are in doubt of whether this would be a tourism industry or not, if visitors were seized, like sadly happened during the pandemic, these industries would be really suffering, will be going out of market, or really suffering because it would have a significant decrease in their production, because they're not going to be selling because they don't have a market to sell it to. Okay, so that's kind of the logic. So tourism industries, the attraction of visitors represents an important part of what they offer. Not meaning that they don't sell products and services or goods and services to people that do not qualify under their definition of visitor. Because if you think on a restaurant can be placed in a very hot spot, tourism hotspot. And since that's the case, imagine 90% of the clients are visitors, but 10% can be people working around and they are having their coffee or having their quick lunch on weekdays, for instance, and it's more on weekends that so dinner weekdays and lunch and dinner over the weekend is for visitors, for instance. It depends. So it's not a matter of you're only selling to visitors. It's like they're mostly selling to visitors. So in order to identify tourism industries, which is the critical starting point for the full discussion, and I haven't even mentioned about women and men so far. I'm starting from the really beginning. So we know that they're not easily identifiable, but there are tools that help, thanks to, as Clara was saying, international agreements and consensus. So if we adopt as a country the revised international classifications of activities and products, for instance, the International Standard Industrial Classification, so ISIC, the revision 4, and Central Power Classification, what we are saying is that we are encouraging countries to follow these classifications. These help us as countries identify each of our countries, our tourism industries. Because it's, as always, this is a recommendation that then we have to bring to what makes sense to our country. So in the international recommendations on tourism statistics, these are the list of tourism characteristic consumption products and tourism economic activities, okay? So probably you're super aware of this. So we have accommodation for visitors, food and beverage, railway, road, water, and air, so the 4 types of transport. Then transport equipment rental, travel agency and other reservation services activities, cultural activities, sports and recreational activities, retail trade of country-specific tourism characteristic goods. And then the number 12 is something more that is going to be more country-specific tourism characteristic activities. So something that, for instance, could be activities that are specifically handicrafts or so that are specifically aimed for the visitors, pivoting on materials that are specific to our country. So it depends. 12 is quite open for countries to define it for themselves without classing with other sectors like the commerce or retail sector or so. In this sense, I think the next slide can help. It's super small, but I'll hope you'll listen to me. Hopefully you can follow what I say. So on the second column, what we have is the tourism industries, the same that I just talked about. Then ISIC Reg 4, as we were talking, this classification has different numbers. And on the description, it says, for instance, within the accommodation for visitors, we can have short-term accommodation activities. We can have camping grounds, recreational vehicle parks, and trailer parks. So they're already giving you kind of examples of what we mean by this kind of big concept. So for instance, cultural activities that I can imagine that there we can have doubts because there are many different cultural activities. So according to ISIC Reg 4, we would have the 9001, which is creative arts and entertainment activities, or 9102, museum activities and operation of historical sites and buildings, botanical and zoological gardens and nature reserves activities. On the sports and recreational activities, we can have renting and leasing of recreational sport goods. So for instance, these usual active tourism companies that rent kayak, for instance, or gambling and betting activities, operation of sports activities, so actually teaching you how to do kayak or surfing or well, plenty other activities that are adrenaline important for visitors. Other sport activities, activities of amusement parks and theme parks, other amusement and recreation activities, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that this kind of further helps what it's inside these kind of big concepts as tourism industries. And this is something that helps countries to identify when we are thinking on employment in the tourism industries. That I'll go into that concept in a minute. So before that, I would like you to go to menti.com on your computer, on your cell phone if you want, and you type this number, 1248 0820. Okay, so menti.com, 1248 0820. There's a question there for you. I'll share my screen so that you can see the question also. So this is the question. Do you have a statistically identified tourism industries in your country? So basically it means that there has been a decision-making process. There's a consensus in your country that you have identified which are tourism industries. And statistically, you're actually measuring them. Thank you for responding. Okay, so we have quite a few countries that have identified tourism industries, some that are partially have identified some of them, which actually is quite common, and one that is still probably in the process of defining them. I'll give you one more minute. I know we are 63 participants, but we're not 63 countries. So I understand that the numbers have to be smaller. So thank you for participating on this. So there's a clear yes, and there's a clear partially also. So thank you for this. This is kind of the big first step to be done so that we can go on into, tourism industries, then employment, and then the disaggregation in terms of women's employment or men employment. Thank you for that. I'll be going back to my presentation. All right, so Menti is open. So if you want to continue, we'll see later the final results, and there'll be more questions. I assure you that. So one thing that we have to be clear is what I was saying about tourism industries also service to non-visitors. So not all employment is attributable to tourism. So the example that I gave, if you can visualize, for instance, certain neighborhoods in El Cairo, for instance, in Egypt, they're going to be neighborhoods that are completely hot spots for visitors, where we're going to have food and beverage, which is the tourism industry, that are probably 99% or 100% of their clients are visitors. But then we're going to have bars and restaurants in neighborhoods, I continue with my example in El Cairo, that probably are not so visited by visitors. Perhaps there are some vacation homes over there, and there are some that are coming up or so, and perhaps there are some visitors, but it can be the opposite. It can be like 90% of the clients of those bars or restaurants are used by everyday workers that are in nearby offices, buildings, and so. And they are still bar and restaurants, they are food and beverage industries, but they're located in a place that is not highly visited by visitors. And they are still tourism industries. So we have to be aware that even the tourism industries service to visitors, but probably not 100%. So we have, that's why there's the relevance of the tourism ratio that we have to research and understand in each of our countries for each of our different tourism industries. So in that sense, we have to distinguish two key concepts. So one is clearly employment in the tourism industries, and another one is tourism employment. And perhaps you say, what? Come in again? Yeah, I understand that it sounds like very similar, but the logic is that employment in the tourism industries means that we are taking into account all the jobs a person is employed, providing tourism and non-tourism services in all the tourism industries establishments. So these are people working in the tourism industries. Some of them might be completely giving these services to visitors, and some might not be giving services to visitors because, as we said, certain, in my example, bars and restaurants might not be actually serving visitors, but you as an employee of that bar, you are a tourism, you are an employee of a tourism industry. Then tourism employment would be employment that is strictly related to goods and services purchased by visitors, produced by tourism industries or other industries. So we have tourism industries and other industries, but services only to visitors, that would be tourism employment. Okay, there's one, yeah. So I hope that this helps, this image. So we can have our full employment in the economy. Okay, that's the biggest rectangular form that we have there. Within that, we have one circle that talks about employment in the tourism industries. Then we have the circle with the employment that can be attributed to tourism, okay? And so what combines would be only those jobs that can be partly on tourism industries, partly non-tourism industries, but are servicing to visitors. And that would be direct tourism employment, okay, that can be attributed to tourism spending in tourism and non-tourism industries. So very complex to measure tourism employment. Certainly, if we have identified our tourism industries, much feasible in many cases to identify the employment in the tourism industries, knowing that there's the tourism ratio within that. Okay, so employment in tourism. I insist on this concept, okay? Tourism employment can be measured as direct tourism employment or direct tourism employment in tourism industries. So the first one would be, direct tourism employment measures jobs in tourism industries that can be attributed to tourism spending plus jobs in non-tourism industries that can be directly attributed to tourism spending. And the second refers to the jobs that can be attributed to tourism spending specifically in the tourism industries, okay? That's the tricky part. So I think that this graph is gonna help. So it seems like I'm mixing the words all the time, so it sounds even more complex than probably what it is. But so if you think in an economy, this is an example of Canada. If you see these darker gray bars that are the longest ones, those ones represent employment in tourism industries. So there we're counting all persons employed within what this country, Canada, has considered to be tourism industries. Perfect. Then if we look at the bars that are much smaller, that are clear gray, there what we have is direct tourism employment in the tourism industries, okay? So out of all the tourism employments, which are the ones, the persons employed that actually directly are selling just to visitors? And then we have a line that is slightly over that is the black line, that is the direct tourism employment. Why? Because we're gonna have employments that have to be added to the clear gray, that are the ones that are working in non-tourism industries, but are actually servicing visitors, okay? I hope that this was the clearest of all, you know, to explain this concept. So now I'm gonna be asking you to go again to menti.com, same number as before, so 1248 0820. Okay, let's go there. We're gonna see first probably the results of the question before. So in the end was mostly yes and a bit partially. And now I open the next question, which is, do you have data in your country on tourism employment? Remembering that tourism employment would mean persons employed in tourism industries and non-tourism industries, but are actually specifically serving to visitors. Thank you for responding. Someone has opened their microphone. If you can mute it, please. Thank you. Okay. I hope that this was understood, that tourism employment would mean that we know the number of persons employed in tourism industries and non-tourism industries, but that are directly attributable to selling goods and services to visitors. So usually it's difficult to have this, but it's wonderful that this 16 countries actually have this in their countries. And I understand the no, because it's very, very complex to have it, because it has to be attributable to visitors spending. And now the next question would be, do you have data on employment in the tourism industry? So here you're counting all persons employed in the tourism industries, despite them selling services to visitors or not. All right, thank you very much. So this would be kind of the first step. So we have the tourism industries, that was the first step. And the second one is having the data on employment in the tourism industries. That's the concept that IRTS is revolving around all the time. So thank you very much. And well, this basically means that UNWTO is happy to help all those that are in now responding no, and hopefully they have the interest to have them in the future. So this is the reason why these workshops are actually organized, so that we encourage countries to move forward and to overcome the barriers that make them respond no to these questions. So the focus on IRTS is precisely measuring employment in tourism industries. So in that logic, we have to take into account certain concepts. So the employed person is slightly different than employment and job. Paid employment, self-employment, employees, employers, on-account workers, casual employees, workers in short-term employment, workers in seasonal employment, out workers. So it's true that I'm not going to have time to go in full detail with all the concepts, but I'm going to be touching upon some that are critical. If you remember from the IRTS, the International Recommendation on Recommendations on Tourism Statistics, they're kind of basic concepts that we have to address, and then observation units and the main related characteristics. If you think on tourism industries, we're looking usually the observation unit is the establishment, and then we have monetary and non-monetary characteristics. And on employment, we're going to have the establishment and the household. We're going to have person, size, status in employment, jobs, duration of work, full-time equivalent jobs. Well, we could add plenty there as well, but kind of a minimum there. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So on an employed person, as a key concept, it would mean that employees, so individuals who work for a company in exchange for remuneration in cash or in kind, or self-employed, because we can have own account workers, have the type of work defined as self-employment, have not continuously employed any employees during the reference period. So we can have the two within the employed person. The employee, in the logic of paid employment, okay, there is an agreement, either formal, informal, this changes country to country culturally. Self-employment, so where the remuneration is directly dependent on the profits of the business and derived from the goods and services produced. Employers also on their account or with one or few partners, which hold the type of job defined as self-employment job. And in this capacity, they can be on a continuous basis engaged or with having more persons working for them in their business as employees. Own account workers, of course, working on their own account with one or more partners again. The thing is that they're going to have not engaged on a continuous basis on any employees because it's own account workers really. And it should be noted that during the reference period, the members of this group might have engaged employees provided as a non-continuous basis. So employee versus job position, some employed persons may have more than one job. This is critical, another critical concept. The same way that employment in tourism industries and tourism employment is very important to understand that. This is very important as well. Employee versus job position, because employed persons, may have more than one job. As a consequence, the number of jobs, demand side, and the number of persons employed, supply side are not similar categories and therefore usually do not match. So for instance, we can have employed persons that can have single jobs in the tourism industries in other industries. Okay, it's fine, but they can have one job. And then we have people with multiple jobs. So they are employee persons with multiple jobs. And they can have main job in the tourism industry or main job in other industries. Whichever that is main job, then we can have other sub jobs in the tourism industries or in other industries. And if my main job is in other industries, I can have other jobs in and out tourism industries, no? So this is the logic that if we take into account the demand side and supply side in this logic, they shouldn't be the same number because people might have different jobs. So the same person having different jobs. Also, we can have persons employed, employed persons in the tourism industries, in paid employment, in self-employment, as we were talking about a couple of seconds ago, at work for a wage or salary, with a job not at work. And then we have, those would be the employees, also following particular groups: casual workers, workers in short time, workers in seasonal employment, our workers. And on the other one, we have self-employment, work for a profit, family gaining cash or kind, with an enterprise but not at work. So employers, on-account workers, members of producers cooperatives, so a different classification. In the end, what we want to get, the point is that we want to get to the bottom line there that you can see, full-time equivalent employment. So meaning that we have employed persons in reference period that we are studying in the tourism industries. Remember, in the tourism industries. So within that, we can have single jobs or multiple jobs. Main can be on tourism industries or outside of the main tourism industries. Jobs in reference period in the tourism industries. So we are focusing on that. Employee jobs, self-employed jobs. Then we go into total actual hours worked in the reference period, excluding annual leave, holidays, and if possible, sick leave. We divide it by full-time average actual time, okay, in hours worked per job, excluding again annual leave, holidays, and if possible, sick leave. What it equals is the full-time equivalent employment, which equals number of full-time equivalent jobs, because we have to be aware that in tourism, we have a lot of seasonal jobs, a lot of part-time jobs. So if we really need to understand jobs in tourism, in the tourism industries, we need to get to these full-time equivalent employment. So we need these different steps on employed persons, single job, multiple jobs. Then we go into jobs in the tourism industries, employee, self-employed, total actual hours worked, then divided by the full-time average actual, so that we can actually have the full-time equivalent. I'll explain it I have another slide that also helps in this sense. So employed persons versus job position, as we're talking about, in the sense that the intensity of work may vary from job to job, industry to industry, and from period to period. It's not the same low season, it's not the same peak season. Jobs may differ by working time of persons employed and therefore be expressed in terms of full part-time jobs. It's not sufficient to have data on the number of jobs or persons employed in order to obtain information on the volume of labor performed, because we really need to know total number of working hours will be required to be able to obtain the full-time equivalent, okay? So if all jobs are converted into full-time equivalent employment or annual total hours work, the total volume of labor of a given tourism industry for a given period can be obtained. Okay, so this is an example. So imagine here in the last part. So a part-time worker employed for 20 hours per week, when the full-time job consists of 40 hours, is counted as 0.5 full-time equivalent employment. So that's the point that we want to get at, okay? So it's a unit for measuring employed persons so that they are comparable, even if they work or study are different numbers of hours per week, okay? So the unit is obtained by comparing average number of hours worked by employed persons with the average number of hours of a full-time work. That's the logic. All right, so employment in tourism industries. So the figure on number of jobs by employment status and the number of full-time equivalent jobs by employment status should refer to tourism industries, as we were saying. So our focus is employment in the tourism industries, okay, not so much tourism employment. And employment in the tourism industries, depending on the needs of the users, can be expressed in terms of number of persons, number of jobs, full-time, part-time, number of hour works, and full-time equivalent employment. Very, very critical that we go for that. But we are in an introductory workshop concerning women's employment data in tourism. So these 4 variables are not enough, as we were saying. So what is highly recommended is that when we collect information in countries about employment in the tourism industries, we not just limit ourselves to those 4, but actually are able to have information on employment by age group, gender, nationality, country of residence, type of establishment, occupation, employment status, permanent, temporary employment. So of course, a number of jobs, hours, work, full-time equivalent, educational attainment, so that you can improve also, and usually that is crossed by age and gender as well, working hours, or hours actually work, paid, organization of working time, because as you know, conciliation of the work and personal life is critical. So in that area, having a status in that is relevant, having data or continuous data on that. Compensation of workers also, and usually this is also connected to age, connected to gender, connected to educational attainment as well. Labor costs, in addition to remuneration of the work performed, so cost of vocational training, welfare services. In all these elements help understand the full package of remuneration, and then mixed income of the self-employed. So as you can see, the list of what helps you draw regulations, capacity building, funding schemes, the whole thing is based on you having reliable data that your country can act upon, that is not just these 4 variables, but rather a quite expanded set of variables. So how do we get there? How do we get all that lovely information that we were just talking about? So the data collection and employment in tourism industry is to be integrated into a regular national statistical system. This needs to remind you back to the governance logic that we were talking about before, and the statistical capacity. So it's not only that we have agreement between different entities, but we need to have a sustained statistical capacity, so that we not measure employment in the tourism industry in 2023 because we were super inspired by this workshop and we never do it again. Rather, we incorporate it into the national statistics system within the tourism statistics system. So to achieve better coverage and to obtain more detailed characteristics of persons employed in tourism, countries should, to the extent possible, use the following main groups of data collection sources, which are measuring labor demand, meaning establishment level data, so establishment censuses, and establishment-based sample services. You see census and sample service of establishments. As you remember on the table that I showed you before, when we are looking at tourism industries, our observation unit are establishments. So here, what we're talking about, labor demand, censuses on establishments, sample surveys on establishments as well. Then measuring labor supply, so household level data, okay? So not just establishments, but also household level data. And then here is again, the census about the population and the sample on the household-based sample surveys. And then third one, which would be administrative records, such as employment office registers, social security files, unemployment insurance records, labor inspection records, tax records, okay? Always taking into account the confidentiality of the different sets of data and the sources through which they are obtained. So administrative records usually is kind of the straightforward information that we may get, but be careful. When these records were defined to be obtained by the different entities that have them, they were not thinking on tourism industries, on employment in the tourism industries. So there are tweaks and changes that have to be agreed on from a collaboration and governance perspective, so that they are actually useful for you to make decisions, for you to understand. So national accounts as a major synthetic data source that is used for the TSA, so the table 7, employment in the tourism industries. And if we are using, of course, the logic of the national accounts, these are the basis for the final results of this table 7, no? Employment in full-time equivalents. And it is used for extrapolating structural information, for instance, the breakdown by sex, from other sources to ensure compatibility with the tourism satellite account, okay? So in that logic, in the European case, the statistical classification, but the international standard industrial classification of all economic activities is critical for this. And in this logic, what we have on the TSA is the number of establishments, number of jobs by status and employment, and there we're gonna have employees and self-employed divided by male, female, and total. Okay, so it's something that Not easy, as we were talking about, but following the right steps and being able to have this statistical capacity with funding sustained within our national statistical system, we can move into having this data. Also, number of hours worked by status and employment, as we were talking about before, very critical. And again, we divided by employees and self-employed, male, female. Number of full-time equivalent jobs by status and employment, super critical to be able to obtain that, but without the previous one, we can't. Again, employees and self-employed, male, female, total. As you can see that the column on the first, so the first column is the different tourism industries that we were talking about before, that each country, the number 12, they would decide if they got something there or not. Okay, let's talk about the sources of information we're talking about. Establishment surveys, okay? So from a data collection point of view, we have the establishment-based sample surveys that have certain advantages, okay? You know, methodology, never perfect. we do as best as we can, but we have to understand the data that we obtain, how it was obtained, so that we understand the pros and cons, advantages and shortcomings of any methodology that we use. So the advantages of over other sources of information is that the statistics on jobs or persons employed, earning, wages, hours of work on a current basis and frequent intervals. So firstly, why? The establishments are the ones that hire and pay workers and are best placed to provide detailed information on jobs, employment, wages paid, hours worked, labor cost, female, male. Secondly, establishments can be easily identified by type of economic activity, geographical location. For that, we really need to have an establishment census, as we were mentioning. Therefore, when the focus is on specific industries, as in the case of our tourism industries, establishment surveys given an appropriate sampling frame can provide an in-depth picture of the target industries. Okay, that's the logic of why it makes sense to do establishment surveys. All these multiple topics are covered by a variety of establishment surveys, no? So it's designed to obtain specific information, such as production, export, employment. So what I mean is that usually you don't do the establishment survey only for male-female employment, okay, or hours worked. You want a big set of variables once you're already doing this investment on this sampling and this survey. In terms of wage structure, labor costs, job vacancies, hiring and firing practices, a skill level, future employment prospects. So informal establishments are out of the picture, okay, are not covered by conventional establishment surveys. In different countries, this informal portion is pretty relevant, so it has to be addressed, okay? And employment in the informal sector is measured with a specially designed informal sector survey. So a secondary service should be done, or secondary or second survey, not secondary. However, an establishment survey counts each employee, whether full or part-time, regular or casual, as one person employed, which results in double counting because if you ask me, as I'm a company A, and I tell you that I have 30 employees, but 2 of my employees, when you ask my colleague, company B, they work there as well, you're gonna count them twice, okay? Which results in double counting through the enumeration of some individuals in more than one job, as we were talking about, okay? So as I said, no methodology is perfect. Measurement errors in the data on a single large establishment may have a substantial effect on total findings. So we have to be careful in the sense that these can have a double count. They are reliable, okay, but we need, in order to do establishment surveys, we need reliable, up-to-date economic censuses and business registers to build a representative sample that does not only take into account large companies, because that's the other issue, not only the informal perspective, but from the establishment surveys, if we're only taking into account huge transport companies, huge gastronomy groups, large accommodation chains, we have to be aware that at the local perspective of each of our main destinations, the value chain is formed by pretty small companies, okay? So we cannot just cover the easy ones to detect that are the large enterprises, okay? So our sampling frame has to be conscious about this. Population census, okay? So costly, no doubt. But if you're looking at population and households, if we don't have population census, it's very difficult to do a very good sampling frame on our household surveys. So in addition to investigating household demographics, social characteristics, so on and so forth, we would be obviously interested in activity status, occupation, industry, status in employment, so time worked, income, so on and so forth. Census is also a source of information on previous job, if unemployed or out of the labor force at the time of the observation. Okay, so in order to understand if they had a job in the tourism industries and then they lost it, or okay, sorry. And it's also relevant in terms of individuals' nationality, ethnicity, immigration status, in case that there's something that we have to, continue work on to improve and so on. And the census information, the economic characteristics of the population, classified by occupation, industry, status in employment, and educational level, is very useful for setting regulations, but also to support the value chain. So household surveys are critical. We need a very good sampling, and for that, we need the census. In terms of the sample, we need to have observations that are made or data are collected and then interference are made to the whole population. And there are smaller workloads for interviewers and a longer time period access to data collection if we have so many variables, okay? So most subject matter can be covered in greater detail than in census, there's no doubt there. But one depends on the other. And then the household labor force sample survey, it's a great work to be done, time consuming, of course, but it's an important data source because in principle can cover the entire population of the country, all industries, all categories of works, including the self-employed and the casual workers, okay? It could also help capture the informal employment, okay, if it is done well. And since tourism activities are not evenly distributed across the country geographically, and because they usually constitute a small proportion of the national economy, a household survey may reflect a relatively small number of cases of employment in the tourism industries, unless the sampling frame takes into account that from the start, okay? So that's why we need collaboration and governance. It's the same logic with administrative records. When the Social Security Institute defines their way of collecting data, they're not thinking on tourism industries employment, okay? So, of course, administrative records, they're always cheaper because they're already there, okay? But the statistics from administrative source are not subject to sampling error and hence, unlike the labor force survey, provide accurate information for local areas, but a principal distinction between the use of administrative records and the other sources, the degree to which the statistician is in control of the design and the collection of the records, okay? So we have to be there in the discussion on how the records are collected and the data that is produced. So administrative records are usually initially designed with a little or no thought about the possible statistical use. That's why they have to go through some tweaks so that they are actually useful. So the quality of data themselves, the accuracy, incongruity of concepts and definitions because we are using them for something different, the scope and coverage, confidentiality of the information, and access, particularly when registers are kept outside the National Statistics Office. So now, if you can go to, yeah, I'm going over time, so I might not do that. Examples of countries. Because I really want to go through this topic. So, so in this, Austria, what the approach that the case of Austria is following is that they take a supply side approach, okay, which is adjusted using demand-related data on the TSA tourism ratios. So in the TSA employment module, they're going to be having, of course, this encompassed concepts with the system of national accounts and the logic of number of jobs and full-time equivalents. And the main data source is an employment-related data from the National Account of Statistics, okay? They're gonna be using the classification that we were talking about before at 40 levels so that we can certainly identify the tourism employment. We have the source of information of Austrian, not we, Austria has the Austrian Labor Force Survey, a Statistics and Service Survey, and the Economic Census and Cultural Statistics. So you see they have to take from different sources of information so that they get to the bottom line of the 4-digit level to understand jobs, full-time equivalents, and the rest of data needed. Okay, so it's not just one single source of information. I'm going to go to the example of Brazil. Two entities, sorry, that's in Spanish, but two entities that are involved. So the Institute of Geography and Statistics of Brazil and the Institute of Applied Economic Research, okay? Very important. The first one is responsible for the development of the tourism satellite kind of Brazil. The second one, they do tourism employment and tourism industries and employment in tourism industries, okay? Sorry, tourism employment in the tourism industries and tourism direct employment, sorry for that. It should be emphasized that the second one focuses mainly on the statistics, and in this case, they use a telemarketing survey as a source of information. The first entity, in partnership with the Ministry of Tourism, so here governance is very relevant, they have developed this tourism labor market information system. And there they are able to provide these statistics indicators with estimates of formal and informal employment. We were talking about before that we cannot leave informal employment outside of the picture. And in the case of Brazil, they take it into account in their tourism characteristic activities / industries, okay? And they contain data on regions, broken down by sex, age, education, occupation, compensation, size of establishment, length of service, so the job tenure, and so on. This is the case of Spain that they're showing publicly in their websites. The active population, so this is the labor survey, okay? And they always have the divide by men and women. And the Ministry of Tourism also within their websites, and not just the Statistical Institute, but the Tourism Ministry also is revolving on this, so publishing and making sure that everyone knows that this data is out there, okay, and it can be seen in a more nicer format and also can be downloaded. So I'm just going to be quickly show you this was something that Clara already mentioned. So the table in terms of the data that the Unwto and the compendium is asking countries to complete. I'm going to remove, yeah, I'm going to show you the Excel file where we can look at the data that Unwto is receiving. And here you have employment number of full-time equivalent jobs by status in employment, so male in this case. And you see that there are plenty cases for which we don't have the data, okay? So this is kind of the homework in a way. Unwto desires country to have this information for themselves, to be able to improve the situation of male, female, working in the tourism industries, but also it would be super, super interesting if they report this information to the Unwto as well, so that they can check it, share it, so that you as countries, you can compare yourselves with other countries also in terms of these figures, okay? This here, you did some selection and is in terms of certain countries, and it's really limited in the number of countries that are actually providing the data. So I overtook a few minutes, like 5 minutes from the break. So if you agree with me, mostly Ben, Leandro, Clara, if you're okay with that, we can start instead of at 10:25 as it was foreseen, at 10:30, we come back from the break. And there we are with the 3 different speakers for the country. So thank you very much for, thank you, Ben, for being with me for 45 minutes or 50 minutes. And we'll continue talking about this. We see you back at 10:30, okay? Please don't leave. We see you back so that we give you time to have calls or just walk around a bit and come back to the computer at 10:30, inspired again. Thank you very much. See you at 10:30. I would like to have the pleasure of counting with the 3 speakers for the session 2. which is taking inspiration from real cases. We're going to have a roundtable of real cases of countries, counting with women's employment data in tourism. Specifically, we have the pleasure of counting with Apollonia Oblak-Flander. She's the Director of Environmental Statistics at the Statistical Office of the Republic of Slovenia. In Apollonia is at present the Director and as the ex-head of the unit covering the domain of tourism statistics, she continues to be actively involved in the development of official tourism statistics with the aim of adequately respond to the newly emerging data needs regarding tourism statistics, originating from the challenging times that tourism is currently facing and we face in the future. So thank you very much, Apollonia, for being with us today. Also, we have the pleasure of counting with a representative from Hassan Hanna, Assistant Deputy Minister for Business Intelligence from Saudi Arabia. So Hassan is an executive with over 15 years of experience in IT, data management, and business intelligence. Hassan holds a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from the University of Manchester. A master's degree in information management from UC Berkeley, and a master's degree in engineering management from KFUPM, he started at Saudi Aramco working on various IT, DM, and BI roles. In 2017, he joined the National Center for Performance Measurement, where he held several roles related to data management and analytics before leading performance measurement operations. In 2020, he joined the Ministry of Tourism of Saudi Arabia to establish the Tourism Intelligence Center and is currently the Assistant Deputy Minister for Business Intelligence at the Ministry of Tourism of Saudi Arabia. So thank you, Hassan, to be with us. And also we have a third country, and that is represented by Sondi Chilembo, Data Manager at the Ministry of Tourism of Zambia. Sondi has served the government of the Republic of Zambia for the last 28 years. He's data manager at the Ministry of Tourism and is responsible for data management and information systems. He has served at various levels at Ministries of Finance and National Planning, Lands and Natural Resources, Education, Technology and Science, and E-Government Division at Cabinet Office, among others. Currently spearheading the process of establishing a tourism satellite account for Zambia, and is a focal point for the Tourism Natural Capital Account and the Wealth Valuation for Ecosystem Services, WAVES project. So welcome, Sondi also. Welcome, the three of you. I would like to start, as we agreed, with certain questions so that it is a real roundtable, okay? So the question first that I would like to ask is, what sources of information do you use to obtain information and employment in tourism industries? So if you allow me, Apollonia, you would be the first one to answer, then Hassan, and then Sondi, okay? So Apollonia, go ahead.
So thank you for inviting me to this workshop and this roundtable. It was extremely interesting, although I have already a lot of information and knowledge. Nevertheless, it was really interesting. So let me say that in Slovenia, we are quite lucky because we have several sources which we can use for the information on employment in tourism industries. The first one is the Statistical Business Register and the Structural Business Survey. I must say that these two sources have only the variable on the number of employed. So it's not the perfect source, but it's like auxiliary sources. Then we have the Statistical Register of Employed Persons and Labor Force Survey. And those two sources are actually focusing on the persons, on the unit observed, so which also give us the information on the gender, which is very good to work further. Yes. Okay. Thank you. That's for the start.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Very clear, straight to the point. So, Hassan.
So, pleasure to be with you all. I'll get right to the question. So previously we used to rely heavily on a specialized survey for tourism establishments to measure employment. However,
sorry, Hassan, to interrupt you. Do you have headphones that you could use?
No.
No?
Not right now. You can't hear me well?
If you can approach a bit more the microphone of your computer. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
So,
you. Sorry. Thank you.
so before we used to rely on a specialized survey for tourism establishments that used to be run by the NSO, but due to COVID, we had difficulties with it. So we had to find different sources. So now we rely heavily on admin data. And we're lucky in the country that, and I'm gonna maybe give more details on it later, is that the predominant form of employment we have is full-time employment, and social insurance is mandatory on an individual level. So we're able to rely heavily on admin records to actually get employment data in tourism activities, and by gender, we get salaries, we get educational levels, we get job titles. So we have a very strong admin records. That's a result of years of government integration, etc. And that's what we're using now. We are reactivating the survey with the NSO. We have some of the members of NSO with us here in the workshop to help now calibrate both. Before we used to rely on one, not the other. Now we want to work on how do we calibrate both and capture more insights from the data that we get.
Perfect. Very clear. Thank you very much. Sundi, if you can elaborating your experience, Sanji.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this platform and just to share some experiences from the Zambian perspective. Coming to the questions that you've asked, in terms of our country, there are various sources that we rely on. One of the sources that we rely on is the return form. There's a form that the establishment fill in, which is a quarterly return. So they will provide that quarterly return, and it will have information on employment, and of course other data that we require, how much money they're making and room occupancy rates. So that's one data source that we rely on. We also collaborate and work very closely with the Zambia Statistical Agency and the Ministry of Labor. With Zambia Statistical Agency, we work very closely with national accounts. So our colleague in national accounts usually would look at different sources, business registers and other sources. So they'll bring that information on the table. And from Ministry of Labor perspective, of course, they usually carry out that the labor force surveys. So that's another source that we look at, and we'll look at all those sources and see how we work with the information. So basically, those are the sources of information that we use for employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It always happens, I guess, but I'm going to modify slightly the question that follows up. So I'm going to revolve over the same thing that is written there, but I want you to elaborate on the methodologies that these sources of information rely on, so that you combine that response on the methodology with perhaps the limitations that you are seeing or the advances that you think that you are either doing or thinking on implementing. Why? Because think on the audience that is listening to you. Some of them perhaps are thinking on developing this methodology. They might be in a situation of, I have no clue where to start. So be as specific as you can, and also inspiring if you can, because I know that it's not easy. And one element that I would like you to dwell on is also, as you were mentioning, the different sources of information that you're working on, you don't hold them. You don't hold them as yours. You relied on the collaboration of different entities. So if I ask you like this, start with, how did that happen, that you work with these different entities, convince them to share the information? Did it take many years? Was it kind of super straightforward? We start with that, then the methodology that you are, these different sources of information imply, and limitations and advances that you're doing on that. Okay, so elaborate. There's time, so it's difficult for the audience to listen like that. Sorry, I'm gonna be muting that. Yeah, so Apollonia, please, thank you.
So now you challenged us. So if I mentioned before that we have like two sources which could give us information on gender, if we are talking about gender and employment, I must say that in the Slovenian case, the labor force survey is not an appropriate source because Slovenia is very small. And the sample is too small to capture the employment in tourism industries, because the employment in tourism industries represents only 4% of total employment. So maybe also other countries would be in the same position, like small country, not a high share of employment in tourism. So for us, the labor force survey is not an option. So, but we are very lucky, as I said, that we have the statistical register of employed persons. And here I can start your story, how everything started and how come that we have such a good source now for the data. So actually already in 1986, the Statistical Office decided to have a census of employment. And actually this was the basic pillar to build the statistical register of employed persons and also the register of employed persons, which is held by the administrative body. But the source for the I would say for the maintenance are the forms. Nowadays, of course, they are not in paper anymore, they're electronic forms, which are actually the forms when people register for the employment, or they change something in the employment status, or they deregister. So, and this is a very good information to update the register. So the administrative one and also the statistical one. Since we established this register and then it was handed out to the administrative body, we have somehow set the methodology. We have set the variables. We have set actually what is needed. And of course, over the years, it was some variables were added because, of course, times changed. So yes, a good collaboration. I would say a kickoff from the side of Statistical Office. At that time, that was the case, but now you have to go on the other way. So you have to be very proactive when the legislation is put in place, if such a register is about to be established in the country. Check very, very carefully which variables are there, what methodologies, and that the standard classifications are used in the register. We are also very lucky that in Slovenian case, Statistical Office is in charge for all official classifications. And all bodies needs to consult us if this is the classification that is to be used. On the top of that, of course, this was not only the only thing. That's why we built it, the statistical register, because we wanted to bring in also the other sources. And we update monthly data in the statistical register from the central population register. So we have information on the persons. Slovene business register. So we have information on the enterprises where these people are employed. We are using also the information system on the number of employees in public sector, which is also very important because it's a big lump of people working, and also other statistical sources that we are like having on education, occupation, and so on. So it's a huge system, but as you can see, it took us like more than 20 years. So yeah.
Thank you very much. But yeah, in many countries, it took us many years. I just don't want to despair anybody. Okay, Hassan, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay, so our story is slightly different. As I said, we used to rely on a specialized survey for tourism establishment, but because of COVID, we had to change. So before I start, I think something critical to mention is that getting this data is not the job of one entity. It's really an ecosystem effort that everybody has to collaborate. That's one. Two, it's a journey, not a destination, because there is always room to improve on this data. And the third part is each country has its own labor market conditions that has to be catered for when you look into the methodology. So our new admin records journey starts in two different places that then they converge. I think first is there was a law that it's been there for a very long time that for you to to operate a business, you need to have a commercial registration. So it's not really a statistical register, it's a full register. It's a census of all commercial registrations. And then in 2018, it was mandated that each establishment has a designated one or multiple ISIC codes. And it's not text. Each commercial register has a set of ISIC codes associated with it. So now we have a commercial register that is classified by economic activity. On the other side, from the labor market side, employment in Saudi is predominantly based on full-time employment. And expat employees are registered in a system because of visa. And local employees are mandated to have social insurance. So every individual by the national ID is registered in the Ministry of Human Resources against the commercial registration. So the next step was to combine these two. And we have a very strong IT infrastructure in the country that these systems from the different entities are integrated. So now we have one source that is combining the commercial records and the employment records according to ISIC. So now we know who works where and in which sector. The third part was defining what tourism is, and that took us a while. So we took the IRTS and the enforcement of the ISIC to actually isolate which are the ISIC codes that we really need to include down to the 6th level. And I remember we worked with Nagori on this, I think, a couple of years ago and other experts. We isolated what is tourism, and Nagori mentioned this. These are tourism economic activities, not necessarily direct employment in tourism, because that is really hard to isolate in admin records. We're talking economic activities related to tourism. So we worked with now the regulator of the labor market who has all of this data to really build a data set that gives us the full-time employment in the tourism related economic activities by gender, by city. We have the wages, we have the educational levels, we have the job titles. And now we're working, there is a national effort to even unify job titles according to the ESCO 8 standards. So even the job titles will be standardized. So you kind of have a census of everybody who works full-time. This is not free of challenges, definitely. I think 3 main areas that now we're trying to work on, starting with policy direction before looking at data, is sharing economy. And I think it's time for us to look at the IRTS, the jobs part of IRTS, to consider how do we look at the sharing economy, the Ubers and Careems and the Airbnbs, and what kind of guideline we can build on those. So that's one area that we're now exploring to improve. Freelancer and self-employed is a new phenomenon in the labor market in Saudi. And there are regulations now being put in place through admin records that we will add on top of our data. And the third is seasonal and part-timers. Again, wasn't prevalent in the country in the past. Now it's becoming prevalent, and there are regulations that regulate them. Our stance generally is, if there is a regulator for the labor market, let's have a national policy for statistics related to the labor market and consolidate them. That doesn't mean that we're not going to do the special tourism establishment survey with the General Authority of Statistics, our National Statistical Office. But now we'll have more information to help aid that survey. We have a better frame. We have kind of basis of the numbers we should be able to see, and hopefully learn from some of the challenges we had during the past couple of years with COVID, etc., to really run the survey now with visibility on what kind of numbers we should be looking at, and then combine both sources together. I think the benefit of combining both, one, the surveys take time, so you can't really run those on a quarterly basis. And our labor force survey wouldn't go down necessarily to the ISIC levels that we need to isolate tourism. So we need something special. But the admin records are things that we can monitor weekly and monthly. We know almost on a weekly basis, where do we have increase, where we have drop, by nationality, by gender, etc. So the visibility helps us guide our work, but we believe we will run the survey at least for the next couple of years to calibrate until we kind of have a solid choice.
Super clear. Thank you very much. And in the end, it's you're mostly, at least Apollonia and Hassan, you're going for a specific sources, which usually happens in most countries. So Sandy, looking forward to hearing you.
All right, thank you. Our journey goes back to 2013. What had happened is that through our collaboration with Ritosa, who are working very closely with UN and Unwto, we had commenced working on our tourism satellite account. And while working on the tourism satellite account, we realized that this is not something that the ministry could have done on their own. And course, we engaged the Zambia Statistical Agency so that we work together. But again, we realized that we needed to have a platform that makes it official on how we collaborate with the other players that we identified were key to us actualizing Zambia having a satellite account. So through the secretary to the cabinet, he appointed a technical committee from various institutions. So Zambia Statistics Agency was one of those institutions identified, the Central Bank, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Finance, and of course, other players within the tourism industry. So after that was put together, then we met and said, okay, look, let's take stock of what we have. What information are you keeping? So we looked at what we had in tourism. We looked at what the Zambia Statistical Agency had. We looked at what labor had. Of course, as much as we're using labor information, there are gaps. They are not providing all the information that we'd actually want. And also the issue of all the time wanting to have questions embedded in their survey instrument. There's always that challenge where people say, no, we don't want it to be a big instrument. So you are limited with what you can actually provide. So we relied more on what we were getting from the establishments, because the establishments by law are required to submit their returns. So that's more like the source that we actually really rely on. And of course, working with Zamstat's national accounts, usually because of the nature of their work, they pick data from various sources. And I think for us, that has helped us, even where we had challenges where we didn't have enough information. Through the Zambia Statistical Agency, we were able to close up the gaps that we did not have information. And also what we've done, because we noticed, because we would go in the field, and I think COVID brought a lot of lessons, and we had to start thinking outside the box. How do we now collect this information? So we automated that return form. Of course, it's still in its infancy. People are still, not everybody's using it, but at least it's a start. And we are getting returns electronically now. Where we are not collecting, we're still engaging so that they provide that information through hard copy, or not the best of options. But I think as far as we are concerned with what we are seeing, the feedback we're getting, I think we're on the right path. And only hope that through the collaboration that we're having, maybe we could actually better the way we are collecting information. Of course, it's not complete, but I think we are getting somewhere. There are so many variables that we want to have. Of course, we've looked at in terms of classifications, we're using the ISEC, the revised version 4, one that classified. And we've also gone further that those things that are not actually on the things that are country specific, those we've been able to also actually define. So basically, in a nutshell, that's how our journey began. It's still in its infancy, but I think through the collaboration and the platform that we've created, I think there's a better understanding now. We seem to be very clear on where we want to go. And I'm sure we'll get there. We'll get there. Thank you.
That's the spirit. That's the spirit. Mostly on the statistics, a lot of work to do. Very good. Love it. And again, you're going for the specific kind of journey, and it takes us in most countries. That's the case. Okay. I wanted to ask you a tricky question in terms of informal employment. In the methodologies that you have measured, you are covering this as well, or is something that you is perhaps is not relevant in your country, so you're not covering it, or it is somewhat relevant and you are thinking on an exercise on how to cover it, or is it a separate exercise that you have to do? Apollonia, if you can.
Yes, there were some troubles with hearing you, but I think I got the question. Yes, when we look at our sources, we are very happy, but of course there are always things that we would like to improve. And unfortunately, the statistical register of employed persons does not cover informal employment. However, the labor force survey gives us information. Of course, they're not very reliable information. We cannot publish them, but it's information for us to what extent the informal employment is present in the tourism industries or industries related to tourism. As I said, we have only 4% of people employed in tourism industries. So this percentage is even lower. I would estimate, of course, it's always, I mean, the statisticians, we would like to measure everything by the book, but I think that in the case of Slovenia, it's not that relevant. It's not that relevant. We try to use some auxiliary sources also, especially, for example, of unpaid work in the households, but because these people are also somehow health insured, so we get this information also in the source, but it's not that relevant that we would need to invest a lot of time, and we have some sources for calibration of the data. So basically we are on the safe side, I would say.
Understood. It allows you at least to have kind of a ratio on the impact that it has. Very good. Okay, Hassan, your case?
So as I mentioned earlier, we're now focusing a lot on full-timers. Informal does come, as in the case of Slovenia, from labor force survey, but again, because tourism is also smaller and doesn't go to the level of detail, it's not helpful. The special survey we run would be helpful to look at that, especially now post-COVID. Structurally, a lot of things have changed. But generally, we like to rely on sources that are based on policies and that translate into admin records wherever possible. So there are now initiatives in the country for informal employment in the terms of like people who work in the household or who host guests. I think sharing economy in the different forms of sharing economy, whether it's the Ubers of the world or the Airbnbs of the world, there are now efforts to put some policies and also aid. It's not a policy just about enforcement and statistics, but it's also to provide them the kind of support that they require to grow their business. So between government incentives and support and policies, we will be able, with the different stakeholders, to build these registers that are tracked regularly. And we don't have any dispute about those numbers. Because again, one of the challenges with tourism, it's what I call a horizontal sector. When I talk to the Ministry of Transport, there is a chunk there that belongs to tourism. When I speak to any kind of minister, there is that little piece that tourism helps with. So we have to ensure alignment with all of them. So we have consistent definitions, consistent policies. The easiest one is, what is the minimum number of hours for an Uber driver for me to count him in the labor as a worker? That simple question requires alignment with 4 or 5 different entities. But we need that alignment so we have a consistent definition across, and then we can build the systems of register that reflect the policies and the business processes, and then we can generate these better statistics and delineate them. And the beauty of system of registers, and everybody knows, is that you can get down to the gender, get down to the income, get down to the minute details that will help you analyze and dissect that data.
This is gold, Hassan, what you just said. This simple, which is not simple, but complex question that it needs the agreement of all these institutions all together.
Ask me in a year and hopefully we'll get it done.
Okay, perfect. We'll do that. Let's see if Uwto organize another workshop on this topic. Thank you very much. Okay, Sandy, how is it working for you?
So in our case, again, it's for the informal sector. We rely on what the Ministry of Labor provides, though it's not sufficient. Are we thinking about it? I would say we are thinking about it because what has happened now, we have a new government in place, and we have what we call the Constituency Development Fund. This is a fund that they give to constituencies to help them in different aspects. And now this fund has grown, it's too big. I think now each constituency is getting something like 25.6 million. So there's been an encouragement for communities to come up with cooperatives and things like that. So this is something that we are thinking about, but not that it's something that we've been doing, but with all the happenings now, with even the direction that the government is taking, something that we are thinking through and engaging with our colleagues from Labour and Stats to see how do we then begin to collect information from the informal sector.
In the household surveys, perhaps that you might be conducting, perhaps you have some input there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yes, we do.
So you have a bit of input from household, a bit of input from labor, but yeah, not the full picture. Okay, understood. Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Apollonia, go ahead.
I would just like to add something on what Hassan has said about the collaborative economy on the field of short-term accommodation. In the systems like in Slovenia, we want to regulate everything, of course, and also the informal work. So in the past, actually, in Slovenia, we enabled that also those working in collaborative economy registered like providers of short-time accommodation. They pay a small tax per month, like 35 euro. They can work, I think, 150 days per year. So it's really still the collaborative. But this, I would say, law brought that we have everybody in the register. So what is called collaborative in some other member states, in Slovenian case, we have a register of accommodation establishments. It's like, and if you want to run that establishment, you have to have one kind of employment, or you're self-employed, or you're a provider of short-term accommodation. So it was made like a loop. You cannot work within the accommodation if you don't have registered activity. So of course, it's not possible in all member states or in all countries, but it could be a way how to somehow legalize what they do. You collect small amount of taxes, but you have very good system of having everything in the registers.
Very, very good experience. You have now touched upon a very interesting topic, probably for half the audience or more, because in many countries we are having big headaches with that topic. And also the lobbies from the other side of the accommodation aisle. Okay, so now the question, I go back to the script that I gave you, and I'll ask you about the exploitation of these data. In the end, as Marina said at the very beginning of the opening of the workshop, the logic is that countries do act on these data. So if you have knowledge of your different, I know that not all of you represent the Ministry of Tourism, but how do you see that this is actually act upon? So apart from the policies and regulations that you already mentioning to obtain the data, but then perhaps in terms of funding schemes to support either women in tourism or women and men in tourism, or in terms of raising the skill set, or well, different policies that you see that it happens. And I guess that the first question connected to that would be, if you see that the publication of this information happens and it's used beyond even perhaps the ministry.
Yes, thank you for this question. Actually, from the point of view of the statistical office, we are not there yet when it comes to this dissemination where we want it to be. But nevertheless, even if we don't disseminate figures in a way that we would like to disseminate, actually these data are used by our users, because they can be, I mean, we publish annually data, but they can be available monthly. So, and it's very, I mean, we have in the source, we have not only information on the gender, and activities related to tourism, but also on the age, citizenship, employment status, educational attainment, occupation, place of work, place of residence. So these data are really good source, but and it's widely used by the ministries, especially the ministry in charge for tourism. And this also enables the ministry to build the policies for the labor force in tourism also in the long run. Just recently, in Slovenia, the new tourism strategy was adopted for the until 2028. And one of the first priority areas is actually labor force. And in the strategy, especially in relation to women's position in employment in tourism is addressed. So, and also when we had looked at the strategy, I mean, it's full of our data, which means that we have a very good source, which is exploited. It's on our side how to present it to the, I would say, broader public better, to use it also by the private sector and also general public. So this is our main issue now. And sometimes it's problematic, the definitions. The definitions, as you said in the beginning, you know, what it is in, what it is out, whether to use, I mean, also the ratios as in the TSAs or to have, so these concepts are difficult to understand. And I think it's also the main reason why we didn't go ahead with publication so broadly, because we need to define what to publish and how to explain what is in the data. That's the biggest issue for us at the moment.
That's a very, very good point. But it's also that nowadays that people consume quite a lot of video and infographics. And so you can start with raising awareness about the concept, what they mean, so that then you can publish. But yeah, it's a great challenge, to be honest, but it's it is one nonetheless. Okay, thank you very much, Apollonia. Hassan?
Okay, so how do we exploit this data? The National Tourism Strategy was approved in 2019 in Saudi, and then COVID happened. And one of the key targets in that strategy is to add 1 million jobs on top of the current market, reaching around 1.6 million jobs in the tourism sector by 2030. So the first thing is why we needed this data regularly is to measure, to actually know how far are we from our targets. So that's the first exploitation. We monitor this regularly to check against our targets. But then in order to us to build and get the ambitions that we want in our tourism strategy, that requires a lot of investment in capital investment in assets and building destination, but also very heavy investment in human capital. So we actually have a dedicated human capital development strategy for the tourism sector, where we want to attract more people, more nationals and locals to actually have careers in the tourism sector, not just jobs temporary, but actual careers in the tourism sector. Over the last year and a half, we've trained over 130,000 people. And we actually help them find employment in the sector. And we monitor that through our data. One other thing is it actually helps us look at the quality of some of the services. I'll give you an example. If we see that certain hotels or establishments are understaffing in terms of average employee per room, and their quality is bad, we know that there is something there. The quality is not good because they are understaffing, or they're using informal employment. So that data is also used for enforcement and other parts. Every day and every week, we get new questions based on this data, and we try to do use cases on top of it. So spending a lot of time building that data foundation and the granularity that we have helped us. Improving salaries. So you're looking at the data and the average salaries, we managed to increase the government subsidy on tourism salaries beyond any other sector in the country, because we looked at the data and we saw that it wasn't attractive, especially for locals. So you know what? Let's push our subsidy higher so we can actually improve the attractiveness of the sector. So it is being used for policy making, for strategy development, for building human capital on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. I think we lost the Gory.
with questions. Hey, tell me this, that I can operate on that. That's fantastic. Wonderful. Congratulations, Hassan. Sandy, go ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of publication, of course, we publish, and there's very overwhelming response from different data users. And every time now we have to say, what is it that we can do? There all these different data sets that the consumers of data are asking for. I'll give an example. We get a lot of requests from our Ministry of Finance for their economic report, what they do in the economic report. So they'll ask all this. We're getting a lot of requests from investors who want to know what's happening in your sector. And so in terms of what we publish, yes, there's a lot of overwhelming response from the users. But what we've also done, we're developing a strategy, the tourism statistical strategy, and this strategy will feed into the national systems of statistical strategy for the country, what we're calling the NSDS2. So from the tourism perspective, we've looked at what are the issues, where are the gaps, what kind of information in terms of capacity, what kind of capacity do we require to build? Because there's a lot of statistical requirements, but in terms of capacity, again, there are the issues in terms of capacity. So all those are the issues that we're looking at. How do we build capacity to ensure that even this information that we're generating is responsive to the needs of different clients and stakeholders? So basically, that's what we're doing in that.
Perfect. I know this always challenges, as Apollonia was saying. You want to disseminate, but you want people to use it, and sometimes they misinterpret what you have published. And so, yeah, I understand. I'm going to read a few of the chat comments that were there. One is a question that I invite any of you, if you want to respond it to. So it says, in light of the creation of new jobs in the labor market as a result of the changes and developments that the world is witnessing, how can women's share of these jobs be measured in the tourism activities? I think that partially you have responded, to be honest, but and measuring the skills required for each profession. I don't know if you want to compliment or.
I think
No,
skills.
Apollonia, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So, I mean, skills is a different topic. Of course, you have to dig in for the skills. I mean, if you have granular data, timely data, you can quickly see what is going on in the labor market in the field of tourism industries. So you have to have detailed data and just to dig in. If you have data available, of course, but for the skills, how to match the skills, this is more on the side of politics, I would say, because you provided data, you follow it over the years and so or months, and then it's on the politics to build on that, to see if you have data on occupation, and you can also use unemployment registers, you know, and see what skills are there and what is the missing on the market. But this is really challenging, and I think that statistical offices cannot respond to this. So you have to work together to respond adequately, to fill the gaps in the skills available and needed. And then it's not from one day to another. It takes like few years that you have people skilled for the jobs that are here. So it's also the Ministry for Education needs to be involved. So and usually these things are addressed by the national strategies for tourism, how to work, on which domains you have to work, and so on. So it's a broader issue that we cannot solve only with statistics on employment, I would say.
Hassan?
Just to add on on
If
the
you allow me,
discussion.
somebody, since Hassan wanted to speak
Okay.
before, let's go Hassan and then you. Thank you.
So I think these new forms of employment do provide a lot of opportunity for women. In the case of Saudi, we have been receiving or hosting people from across the world for hundreds of years through religious visitors and pilgrimage, etc. My grandmother's house used to host people a month a year, every year, because they come for pilgrimage and they leave. Platforms like Airbnb opened this up and made it easier for people to participate in that kind of economy. I think the skill side, at least in Saudi, for us, it's a competitive advantage that people want to do this, because every time we ask people when they come to Saudi, what did you like the most? They said authenticity and hospitality. So it's part of our DNA. So we do have programs for that, and future programs could come where we give these women the business acumen, how to run this kind of business, how to actually host and operate this kind of Airbnb business in a sustainable way, in a good way. And then we can worry, I think, about measurement. I think measurement is important, but I think building the momentum around those kinds of activities and giving opportunity to people and making them grow, eventually the data will come, but seeing it on the ground, I think, is something we want to see first, and it becomes prevalent, regulated so we can protect the rights of everybody, and the data will come in that sector.
Thank you, Sandy.
Yes, I just wanted to comment and just give the Zambian experience in terms of skills. Usually there's, you would find that what say the training institutions are providing and what the industry requires, sometimes there's a gap. The industry would say we are not very happy with the kind of skills that people are getting. So what we've done as a country, we have a skills fund. So what would happen, each sector would, if they identify the skills gaps that are available, then apply to the skills fund, then get funding, then provide the training to close up those skill gaps that the industry requires. So that's been one of the ways on how we've actually also dealt with the issue of skill gaps in the tourism sector.
Thank you. There, one comment from Syria saying that they are actually would like to refer to this point in Syria. So I'm not sure if the colleague Sasa Al-Sifi wants to do any question to the speakers, or, I mean, we are entering the Q&A section because it's 11:19. So also, there's a colleague from Sudan saying, good morning, sorry for the delay. It's a network problem. In the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Sudan, we calculate the statistics of tourism employment for women within the tourism statistics, but there are many statistics of women's employment in the informal tourism sector that we cannot calculate, sharing the issues that you were talking about before. So any questions from the audience that you would like to address? If you want to speak up, raise your hand and I'll open your mic, or you can write in the chat a given question. If not, I'll ask questions, as for sure. Okay, I don't see that there are questions written, but okay, so first, I wanted to give you the option in case that Apollonia, Hassan, and Sundi, when you were preparing this roundtable, perhaps there was something else that you wanted to say that I didn't ask. So if there's something that is there for you that you wanted to add, I'm happy to hear on that.
Maybe I could add something what was all the time in my mind when I was preparing for this roundtable, that as a statistician, you want to do the things right, so by the book. So it's not always the case that you can do it, but you shouldn't be discouraged to go ahead. And those, I would say, gaps that you could not fill, describe to the users, and try to figure it out what would be the best outcome for your users. sometimes also don't be discouraged if you cannot cover all the industries related to tourism, especially from the structured business survey, because you don't cover non-profitable activities. Because could be that you would have this same information also from the environment, like wastes, energy consumption, and so on. So could be that for some statistics where you would like to have the parallels, go ahead also with part of the tourism industries if this provides better information for your users. This was all the time in my head when I was preparing things. So be courageous and go ahead, explain well, and explore your sources and do best what you can do out of them.
Love it. Very inspiring. Thank you. I don't know if Hassan or Sandy wants to elaborate on that.
I think what Apollonia mentioned is perfect, because perfect is the enemy of good in statistics and in numbers. And definitely when you collaborate with others and everybody understands the different limitations in different data, accept this data for what it is and use it. Because if you start just criticizing the data itself because of its limitations, rather than use what's available and improve on it, you're just not gaining the value of it. You're collecting data and you're putting them in databases that are just gathering dust. So sometimes it's, I have something, let me work on it, improve on it, while we fix the data itself. So I think that's one great learning lessons. And as I said in the beginning, it's a journey. You won't get it perfectly the first time or the second time or the 10th time. But what will keep you going to improve is that if people actually start using it and they want you to improve and they're willing to help. I think that's key. And the collaborative spirit between the different people that work on these numbers and use them, I think is important.
Fully agree. Sandy?
Very much. One of the things that I just wanted to raise when I was preparing and I was thinking, what are the issues that are associated with data and some of the challenges that we've encountered from Zambia's perspective. We started very well. I think along the way, then issues of funding, where data, I think data, sometimes there's always a challenge. The budget kept on dropping and dropping and dropping. Only when you have a lot of issues, then people realize, oh, this is an important issue. I think funding to data is critical because at the end of the day, you are making decisions based, evidence-based decision based on the information that you have. So you cannot, how do you inform policy? You don't have the correct data or information help you make policy. How do you come up with interventions? How do you give incentives to the sector if you do not really understand what is actually happening in the sector? So for me, that was one of the issues that I wanted to raise. Then also what we've noted over the years as we've been collecting this information is that there's a very high turnover of staff in the establishments. So you find this time around, you take people through how you complete these forms and how they're supposed to submit data. Next time you're there, the whole new faces. So that's another issue that we observed, that there's very high turnover of staff, and sometimes then you've got new people, they not that they don't want to provide information, but maybe it's just understanding, not understanding how to complete the information. And also there's always this, I don't know, for some reason, some suspicion. Whenever you're collecting information, I don't know why there's this suspicion. They always want to link data being collected to taxes.
Yeah, exactly. I thought you were going to say taxes, exactly.
So there are all those issues. So I think there's a lot of awareness that we've been doing so that people understand that, look, this information, actually the information that you're providing is not you're not going to appear anywhere. Just a holistic view of what we are providing, not necessarily going into details. And of course, we've got laws that protect. We've got the Statistics Act, and recently we just enacted the Data Protection Act. So those are some of the issues that we are raising. So look, your data is protected. Whatever we are collecting is just to get a holistic view of what is actually going on in the sector. You don't need to worry that we're actually going to those details. Your tax issues, those we don't have interest in that. And also, I think COVID also has taught us lessons that we have to leverage on technology. I think this is one issue that we've not really, now there's an awakening that technology is key. Look, we are now having virtual meetings because of technology. So that's another lesson that we've learned, and I think we're leveraging on technology to make sure that even the solutions that we're providing, the data that we're collecting, asking ourselves, how do we ensure that we take advantage of the technology that is available? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So there's one colleague that is praising Hassan and thanking him for what he said in the chat. There's another colleague that is asking if you can kindly share the budget approximate that you are allocating to collect this critical data. You don't have to respond on a speak. If you want, you can reply on the chat, because I ran out of time and we have more speakers now to come. So I really thank you for being so honest, so transparent about, light and shadows that we go through to obtain the information that the country that you work on needs and to be useful for them. So thank you very much for your time, for your knowledge, and congratulations on all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure being with you all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing this roundtable, really.
With pleasure, in the name of the UN Uwto, they are the ones. Okay, so we move on to the next session. And in the next session, what we have is the pleasure of counting with the colleague from ILO. 1 second. Yeah, so it's Pu Huynh, an International Labor Organization. Is an employment specialist and labor economist for the International Labor Organization for more than 15 years. He has analyzed labor market trends and policies throughout the Asia-Pacific region and advised senior policymakers and representatives of employers and workers' organizations. And Mr. Huynh has published on topics that include working conditions in Asia's garment sector, the impact of Asian integration and skills, technology and the future of jobs, on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on labor markets. He's a graduate of the Northwestern University in the US and Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. We're super happy to have you. So sorry for the 3 minutes delay on your presentation. And we're looking forward to listen to your presentation on the data on tourism industries. Thank you very much. Your screen is frozen. Is everything okay?
Having some connectivity problems right now, but I can see you okay. Can you connect?
Yeah, now I can hear you and see you, and your movements match your sound. So
yeah,
that's good.
I hope it stays this way.
Yeah.
So again, thank you, Nagori, for the introduction. Also, thank.
Yeah, we lost you again.
Uh-oh.
Is there other network that you can connect to, or?
I can.
Yeah, because now it's red. Before it was white, then yellow, and now it's red. Your connection, I mean.
Okay, let me see if there's anything I could do here. 1 second.
Sure. In the meantime, I'll read some chat comments. So there's a colleague that is saying that he wants to start the Egyptian case in the sense that if anybody wants to look in the chat in the sense of how they are using the labor force survey to move forward in order to measure the different topics that we were talking about, so that they're relying on the labor force survey. They're also relying on ISIC Red 4 for the TSA, and collecting data on employment in each activity as mentioned. Thank you very much for sharing their experience on Egypt, sorry. Okay, so now it seems like your connection is white, which seems to be good.
I think we should just go with this and give it a best shot, okay?
Perfect. Okay, share your screen if you can.
Yes. So again, thank you very much. What I wanted to do is to share some of the key findings that we published late last year on COVID-19 and employment in the tourism industry in the Asia Pacific region. This is a brief that came out in October of last year. In terms of the methodology, and I really appreciate the earlier presentations talking about the complexity in terms of measuring employment in the tourism industries, because this approach that we took is quite simplified, to be very frank. And we opted for simplicity, obviously, because of a number of different factors. One is our limitations in terms of data access. In case of accessing microdata from the different NSOs in which we have partnership agreements with in the Asia Pacific region. That was one factor. Another factor was the need for cross-country comparability into looking at a regional perspective. And so we are bound in that regard. So this, again, looks at employment in the tourism industry, looking from the perspective of labor supply mostly, relying on household surveys, specifically from labor force surveys themselves, looking at the period from 2019 to 2021, specifically the impact of COVID-19. And it does not attempt to measure the full-time equivalent employment in tourism or some of the other measurements that were discussed earlier today. So I want to be very clear about that. But in doing so, we are able to use the labor force survey microdata in 5 countries, Brunei, Mongolia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And it gave us the ability to harmonize the data and to do some cross-country comparability here. And our focus was on 3 different aspects, specifically employment, working hours, and wages, to see what the impact had been during COVID-19. Obviously, with the way the data is structured in the labor force survey, we were able to do disaggregations by sex, as well as looking at subnational differences across different regions, different provinces, and such. And for us, another area of interest was looking at what's happening in the tourism sector versus non-tourism sectors, because we wanted to really highlight the extreme impact of the restrictions during the COVID-19 period and what that was doing for the tourism sector specifically. And in terms of these definitions of the sectors, we relied on the definitions that were outlined in the UNWTO and ILO publication from 2014. And I believe this is what was shared earlier today in terms of the 10 major tourism sectors. So I won't go into this anymore here, but I just wanted to flag 2 things that really stood out in terms of when we started to dig into the data. And what we found was that a lot of the employment was concentrated in this category 2, and specifically in the first subsector, 5610, restaurants and mobile food service activities. And specifically in light of the developing Asia countries, such as in Thailand and Vietnam, there's a high number of mobile food vendors, street vendors selling food services, and they get captured in this category here. And so that captures a very high number of employments in this tourism industry. And another important point here is the fact that oftentimes is dominated by women as well. And likewise, I want to flag road passenger transport, ISIC code 4922, because what we saw was that in the countries that we analyzed, especially in Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand, there's a significant number of men who are employed in services such as short distance taxi transport on motorcycles or on cyclos, 3-wheel taxis and such, and they also get captured in this category as well too. So these also really drove up some of the employment numbers. In terms of some of the key trends overall during the COVID-19 pandemic, first of all, in the 5 countries using, again, this simplified methodology, we see about 12.9 million workers employed in the tourism sector. At the outset of COVID-19, it's a little bit more skewed towards men, about 7.1 million compared to 5.8 million women.
We lost you a bit. Hopefully you're coming back. Hello? Hello, Pooh? Yeah, hello? We
Okay,
lost
can you hear me?
Yeah, like a minute ago we lost you. So if you can
Okay.
recap probably something that you said last.
Okay, yeah, so just pointing out that at the outset of COVID-19, we estimated using this approach about 12.9 million workers in those 5 countries, a little bit skewed more towards men. And during that first wave of 2020, during the initial wave of the COVID surge, we saw 1.6 million jobs lost in the tourism industries. Again, a little bit more skewed towards men than women. However, when we look at average working hours in tourism, the losses were about 2 to 7 times more than what we saw in non-tourism. So we can again see the significant impact in the tourism sector. When we looked at wage declines, they were quite significant across all 5 countries, but the heaviest in Vietnam at about 18% overall, and even higher wage losses for women. And then an important point is that with the labor force survey, we could also look at informal employment in some of the countries in which they capture that. So Vietnam was a perfect example. And what we saw was a shift towards workers in informal tourism jobs and into more lower quality employment. And finally, another point that I'll touch upon a little bit later as well too was the shift that we saw in terms of women moving into that category of food and beverage services, which oftentimes are the lowest paid jobs in tourism sectors. And so we're talking about another example of which job quality is deteriorating in this COVID crisis. Now, in terms of the job losses, we can see significant job losses, especially in Brunei, in the Philippines. There's obviously differences between men and women in different countries, so it really varies from country to country. In the case of Thailand, what we saw is that employment losses were not the largest outcome or consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, we saw a significant rise of workers who were still employed, but under 0 hours of employment. So obviously there were some arrangements or negotiations in terms of that employer-employee relationship to maintain those jobs, even though they were not officially working. And in the case of Vietnam, actually, this doesn't capture well because Vietnam, the surge in COVID really took place in 2021. So the employment losses we see here may not fully capture what we would expect to see when we look at the 2021 data. When we turn to hours of work, here we also see the significant drop in Brunei Darussalam, as well as the Philippines, and across the board. It's tended to be that men were, in 4 of the 5 countries, men had bigger losses in the average hours of work. But with that said, though, there were still significant impacts on women as well. In terms of wages, a couple things just to point out here is that we saw a couple cases where, like in Mongolia, for women and for men and women in the Philippines, we saw actual increase in the average wages in the tourism industry. And I think that sort of masks a different phenomenon, which is this compositional effect, right? When you have workers who are losing their jobs and they're the low end of the pay scale, then that boosts up the average pay for the sector as a whole upward. So it actually shows a deterioration in the overall conditions of the sector, but just that the employment of the low paid workers are the ones that are most affected. And here, at the time that we released this report, what we were able to tap into was the initial data from the first quarter of 2021 to see what was happening. And we had this data for just 2 countries, Thailand and Vietnam. And what we see goes back to this point that I mentioned earlier about this transition towards lower quality jobs. The main concern here is that we saw an overall increase in employment, especially for women. But if you look at what's happening, it's really being driven by this one sector, food and beverage serving activities. And in these 2 countries specifically,
We lost you again. Hopefully you're coming back. You were saying that in these 2 countries specifically, Thailand and Vietnam.
okay.
Yeah.
Yes, and so, okay, great. I'm sorry about that again. I apologize about this connectivity problem. But again, in Thailand and Vietnam, what we saw is that, it looks like there's a rebound starting in Q1 2021 in the first quarter, especially for women. But if you look at it more closely, we see that it's a transition towards more jobs in the food and beverage serving activities. And in countries, we know that these are dominated by street food vendors. So we really have to question whether or not, that really taps into the tour. So let me finish here by just sharing some of the insights we gained from this process, looking at these 5 countries and using this measurement methodology. So obviously this is a simplified approach, but there was a benefit in terms of being able to use an established regular household survey that already had data that was sex disaggregated and already had alignment with the ISIC industry codes. So it was relatively easy, and it also provided, again, ease for us to do cross-country harmonized comparisons. Obviously, some caveats, though, is that it does require access to the microdata and ISIC disaggregation by the 4-digit level. So we know that many national statistical offices in the Asia Pacific region have this data, but we don't have access to that data, or they may not be publishing that data at that level. So it's a matter of actually having that access as well. We also recognize that this process, this methodology does not actually capture the full extent of employment in tourism-related value chains. Obviously, for example, if a hotel links up with a specific agricultural sector to source some of their ingredients in their dining facilities, for example, that would not be captured as just one example. We also know that it does not capture retail trade of country-specific tourism goods, such as souvenir products, for example. And finally, again, this is a point that has already been alluded to, but just want to emphasize again, in developing Asia specifically, when we see a lot of the informal employment in motorbike taxis, in mobile street food vendors, for example, there's a concern that there may be some overestimation of tourism jobs in these specific subsectors. Again, this goes to what you alluded to earlier today, Gloria, about the tourism ratio of the jobs and whether this fully captures it or not. So with that said, let me end it here. Thank you very much again. I turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was really insightful, to be honest, and being able to understand what you were able to capture, and these also being transparent in this sense, no, in the methodology that we always have to know what we were able to capture with that methodology and what we can't. So thank you very much for your insights, and then for all the work that you're trying to do to help all of us countries in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so now we have the pleasure of counting with UN Women representative. I think that you're here with us, Isabella. Yeah, all right, perfect.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to share some information about gender statistics with you. I have a very poor internet connection.
Okay.
And would therefore...
If you allow me, I want to introduce you first before
okay.
You start with the presentation. And if you want, I can share your screen, whatever you prefer. Well, what I mean is I can share your slides, whatever you prefer. Okay,
so I started sharing, so that's fine. Let me continue then.
Okay, I'll introduce you then. Isabella Smith is the Regional Gender Statistics Advisor for East and Southern Africa in UN Women. So has a PhD in International Development, also a MPhil degree in Urban and Regional Science and a Master of Science in Human Nutrition. She majored for her BSc degree in Mathematical Statistics and Human Psychology and for her BA degree in Anthropology and Development Administration. She's currently the UN Women Regional Gender Statistics, as we said, for the East and Southern African region. Her main responsibility to coordinate and provide technical support as part of the UN Women's Gender Data and Statistics flagship project, Women Count. And prior to joining the UN Women SR office, Dr. Smith was the Chief Director of Social Statistics at Statistics South Africa for over 10 years. So we are super happy to have you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me start by just saying that my brief has been to just introduce the audience to the basic concepts around gender data and statistics. And I'll
Sorry
try
to
to do.
interrupt you. We don't see you. I don't know if it's a matter of not being able to use the camera or.
Okay, so I have a very poor internet connection, and
Okay, so
therefore,
we stay with sound.
yeah, I will just use sound.
Perfect. Sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
So I'm just going to go through the basics, and towards the end, I'll explain a little bit what the linkages are with the work that you've been doing in relation to gender and tourism. So the big confusion often when people are using gender data and statistics is what's the difference between sex and gender. And I think the most important distinguishing factor is really that sex relates to biological sex. Therefore, have you been born with the characteristics of a woman or a man, or in some cases intersex, whereas gender is really a social construct and refers to how we attribute specific characteristics to women and men, depending on a lot of factors, including the cultural context within which this takes place. So when we do statistical measurement, quite often we confuse the concept sex and gender in the wording of the questions that we ask. If we ask, what is your sex? There are two possibilities, woman and man. And of course, there is a continuum. There are people who are born with biological characteristics that are associated with men and women. And there you would probably identify as intersex or other. So when you ask, what is your gender? This clearly refers to your social constructs and the way you identify within your cultural context. And there's a big continuum there of potential responses. Some people identify as non-binary, cisgender, transgender, etc., etc. So gender equality, many of you may be familiar with this, really refers to a state where women and men enjoy equal rights, opportunities, and entitlements. And it also directly correlates with increases in productivity, health, and standard of living that positively affects all women, men, boys, and girls in society. So gender equality is seen as something that's beneficial to both women and men, boys and girls. Equity is slightly different. It's a process of being fair to women and men. And so when you talk about equity, it's not only referring to creating equal opportunities, but it's going much further. It's saying if there has been a disadvantaged group, how do you level the playing field? Therefore, you introduce strategies. This could be quotas, for example, that helps to mitigate historical disadvantages that one group may have suffered. Some additional terminology that I think is useful in this context is the idea of gender parity. And that's really when there is equality between women and men, boys and girls. And parity is often expressed as a ratio of the female to male values of a given indicator. So you would typically men with particular characteristics, women with particular characteristics with each other, and they have a ratio that's either smaller or bigger than 1.
So sorry, Isabella, but now you're breaking up. It's difficult to understand.
Sorry, you can't hear.
It's very difficult. Not all the words are heard completely. Try again and see if it has improved. Perhaps it comes and goes, the connection. Oops, I think we lost her. Yeah, This is not longer in the call. Okay, I wanted to give her a minute.
Hello, I'm back in. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Lovely. Okay.
Okay, apologies. I really have a bad connection, but let me just quickly move on. So gender mainstream looks at how can we better accommodate issues.
Yeah, again, we lost you. What I'm thinking is that perhaps I can share your screen so that you don't have to. So I'll share it for you. Yeah, so I'm sharing the screen for you in case that helps.
Oh, there's another participant sharing.
Yeah, it's me. It's me. sharing it. So
Okay, so let's just continue. I think move on one slide. I've also finished this. You can go to the next one. So as I said, gender statistics really look at measuring the differences between women and men and also try to quantify the inequalities between them. Next one.
Sure.
We also
Nagore, I believe you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. So Isabella, I stopped the presentation. Okay, I think that we'll have to look for another occasion to listen to the work that you are doing in UN Count and Women Count in UN Women organization, because it was a very, very important presentation, very interesting, but we were losing part of well, quite a big part of what you were trying to tell us. So I'll continue with the program, and in that logic, I'm going to do the quick takeaways of the session of today's introductory workshop before we close the session. Well, before that, if you allow me, I would like to ask you all to do a family picture. So if you want, remember that this is being recorded and this is a family picture. But if you want, you can turn on your cameras, smile, and I'll take.
Hi, I'm back again.
Yes, Isabella, if you don't mind.
You know, I really apologize.
Yeah, we understand.
Yeah, she
We're
can't
really.
hear me.
we have bad luck with your connection. Hopefully there's other workshop that we can.
You know, I would suggest, given my poor connection, that you perhaps continue with the next
Exactly.
presentation.
Yeah,
and then we'll see if my positioning.
Exactly, Isabella, that's what we're doing. We're gonna try to do a family picture now, and I'm inviting everyone to turn their cameras on, smile, and I'll tell you when I'll take the picture, okay? All right, so are we ready to smile? Yeah, okay, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, I take a picture. I'm gonna go to the second screen now. So for the other ones that are, because you are divided in different screens. So I'll take another picture so you can smile again. Okie doke. And then the last one. All right, so smile again. 1, 2, 3. Very good, family picture. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll go to the key takeaways of the session. Thank you again. Okay, so. All right, so one of the key words that we were listening over and over, not just because I mentioned it, but Marina did mention it, Clara did mention it, certainly Apollonia and Hassan and Sundi, in the sense of how relevant it is that you listen to users, what they need, and if they see that it's useful, they're also going to be supporters of what you're measuring, and how if from the beginning we are already collaborating together to define the sources of information, the methodologies to obtain these data, we're going to have a bigger chance of succeeding, and again, responding to the questions that they have. So institutional cooperation, as we were saying, it's critical in that sense. We need to strengthen the statistical capacity. As Sundi was saying, it's critical to sustain this statistical capacity, to evolve, as he was saying, that it was a wake-up call in many senses for many countries implementing technology, moving away from hard copies, and keep improving in that way, knowing that there's a digital divide also, but a strengthening statistical capacity in many other senses, not just technology, but in terms of really being experts in the different methodologies and methods that are to be implemented. We, as this is a Un and Unwto introductory workshop, certainly we are recommending strongly that different countries, they are guided by international recommendations that already exist, like the RTS, so the International Recommendations on Tourism Statistics and the Tourism Satellite Account, so that we can all compare and not only measure sex breakdown, as we were talking about, or even if we go for gender background, which currently is a bit complex to do that, but also publish the data. And we, in that sense, as Apollonia was pointing out, we need to raise awareness of what the concepts mean, so that when we read them, the different users, we actually understand the same meaning behind those words. And we need to raise awareness also on the importance of measuring this and using the data for public policy, but also from the private sector perspective to improve all the conditions. We need to apply measures as a result of the measurement. That's the best result that we can have. From a logic of a statistician, what you want is that users use, implement, take measures based on the knowledge that you've been able to provide to them. So we have to promote the use of data and activate the users to even make them aware that this exists, be good at disseminating, as Apollonia was pointing out, and Sundi as well. And as Hassan was saying, so that you reach a situation where they actually ask you for even more data, or can we know this? How do we do? Or do we have information that already replies to that? And what about this other thing? that's the best relationship that we can have between so the data users and the data producers. So in that sense, those are the key takeaways that I would highlight. And I wanted to thank you all for your participation. Now we move on to the closing of the session. And for that, we have the pleasure of counting on Benjamin Owen. All right, Benjamin Owen is the project manager of Center Stage, the project that we mentioned at the very beginning, within the Ethics, Culture, and Social Responsibility Department at Uwto. Ben, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nagore, and to everybody. Yes, I am the project manager for the Center Stage project that we're organizing this workshop within today. So first of all, I'd like to thank the partners of the project, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the German International Agency for International Cooperation, and of course, UN Women, who are our partners on the Center Stage project and have made today possible. I think all of us on the organizational side of things today have been extremely pleased to see the interest that there's been in this workshop today. As Clara mentioned in her presentation at the beginning, this is the first time UNWTO has done a training session specifically on women's employment data, on sex disaggregated data at all. It's something that we, within the Ethics, Culture and Social Responsibility Department, hope to continue to work with our good colleagues in the Statistics Department on. Something we're very keen to continue to support our member states on the production, the reporting of this data. And keen to encourage you now to take today as a first step on the journey towards producing more data to help the policymakers take informed decisions. So finally, I would just like to say a quick round of thank yous to all of our speakers, to Apollonia, to Zondi, and to Hassan, as well as to Pooh from the ILO, and to Isabella from UN Women, being with us today. Our good colleagues in the Statistics Department, thank you for the great collaboration. And Nagore, of course, Nagore, thank you so much for moderating today. It's been a real pleasure. You've kept us all going over this quite long webinar. So I'll wrap it up with a final thank you to all of the participants who have joined today. We've had between 65, 70 throughout, dipping in and out. Real pleasure. We remain at your disposal to continue working together on this, and we really encourage you to go forth and help us change the world. So thank you very much, everybody. And Nagore, I don't know if you have anything closing, admin.